All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our American Marketing Association webinar. My name is Katie Cummings and I will be the moderator for this afternoon's event. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box down below and I'll be happy to help moderate. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Nirmal. He is the president of the AMA. So Nirmal, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everybody for joining. We have an exciting session for you here planned for the Lunch and Learn webinar. But before we jump into the webinar itself, there's a few housekeeping items. One of them being I'd like to introduce you to the chapter and what we are about. So let's start there. So as a chapter, AMA Boston was founded in 1940. So a lot of people don't realize, but we are almost 75 plus years old. We just celebrated our 75th anniversary last year. We are 500 plus members strong and the 4th largest chapter in the country. We're also considered a leader in Boston's marketing community. We have a strong and vibrant membership base and folks from all kinds of disciplines, from healthcare to education to different verticals. We also have and maintain a very strong social media presence with the numbers that you see there. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter and like us on Facebook because that's where we share a lot of our content and best practices as well. So we hope to see you there soon. And as the chapter, our mission is to build a community around shared experiences and bring you the best resources and tools and to nurture connections, both personal and professional. So we want to help you become the leaders of tomorrow, and we hope after this webinar you will consider joining the AMA. And with that, I would like to introduce our speakers for the webinar, 7 Steps to Building Wealth. AssetGrade is an in-kind sponsor for the AMA, so we appreciate their sponsorship. The speakers today are Patrick Cote. Patrick is an alum of Wharton, and he has 20 years of experience in the investment industry at Fidelity and Bain. He's worked on both sides of the Atlantic in London as well as in the US. He's a CFA, as I mentioned, and also an alum of Wharton. And his partner is Susan Powers. Susan also has 20 years of experience in the investment industry, including running the investment consulting practice for $1.2 trillion in retirement plan assets at Fidelity. She also has a CFA, a CPA, and she's a certified financial planner. And she's going to be appearing on the Wharton Business Radio on May 29th at 5 p.m. So look forward to actually hearing her on the radio as well. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome Patrick and Susan to run today's webinar. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nirmal. We're really excited to be here. So the background for today's webinar goes back to the 90s for the book The Millionaire Next Door. If any of you have read it, you'll probably know some of the themes as we go through today's discussion. If not, it's worth a read, even if it's becoming a little dated now. So there are really a number of things that came out of that book, but I think one of the big things from there was that 2/3 of the millionaires are self-employed. This was a study in the 1990s done of millionaires across the country to understand what had they done to become millionaires. And today, obviously, there are a lot more households that are millionaires than there were 20 years ago. And so there are actually over 10 million households across the U.S. that have investable assets worth more than $1 million. And so if we look at the characteristics of some of them, I think it's interesting because they don't necessarily fill the stereotypes that we might all have of wealthy folks. So if we look at those ones that are worth more than 25 million, so that I think those are households that most of us would consider wealthy. 2/3 of them are actually dual income households, and 20% of them either own or have started their own business. The average age is 65, and 70% still work over 40 hours a week. So these are not folks who are just sitting relaxing. Yeah, and there's really a common theme of underconsumption, and we're going to spend more time on this, where they're basically spending less than they earn. You can see the big takeaway too is that more than 80% of them accumulated their wealth in one generation. So these are not folks who inherited the money. So we focus a lot on Henrys, so high earners not rich yet. They're often under accumulators, meaning that if you look at how much money they have the potential to save quite a bit, but there are often a lot of pressures that come along to spend more money, and so it does make accumulating wealth more difficult. So just let me pause for a minute, see if there are any questions that come in. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, as Katie mentioned at the beginning of the webinar.
Hi, Pat. So I do have a question, and someone would like to know, how do you define Henrys? What is the income cutoff? Is there a wealth cutoff?
Yes, that's a great question. And so there are not hard and fast rules. Typically, the cutoff really comes in when folks are able to start saving a significant amount of money. So that tends to be the break point where they start to become a Henry, as opposed to somebody who's making a decent income but not necessarily being able to save a lot. And so what we often see, in the coast, we're in the Boston area, so often around $200,000 for a household income. Once you make more than that across the household, then you typically are able to start saving more if you wanted to be able to save a significant amount. But that doesn't mean that people even well below those levels can't be in a position where they can save a significant amount of money. If you're looking at some of the higher cost areas like the New York City area, it might be significantly more than that just because of the cost of living there. And then if you're in other parts of the country where money. And then in terms of the wealth levels, we often think about $5 million in investable assets as a level where you start to become considered rich. In the old dollars, many folks who've got $1 million assets wouldn't consider themselves rich anymore. They might be considered well off, but probably wouldn't consider themselves rich. So I think for a lot of folks, it's more about how they feel about how, where their income is relative to their expenses, that really they feel comfortable identifying themselves as Henrys. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan to talk about women investors.
Hey, thank you. Well, and thank you everybody for coming today and listening. When we think about the different types of investors, and Pat just talked about the Henrys, near and dear to my heart are women investors, and one of the reasons for that, not only being a woman myself, that's obvious, but after 20 plus years in the financial services industry, less than 20% of the workforce, it became obvious to me that a lot of the products and a lot of the conversations were being handled by men, and that there was an opportunity to broaden the conversation and be more inclusive. And so when we look at this, there are a lot of reasons that we'd want to think about this. In a survey of financial advisors said that when they asked couples about, were they thinking about shorter-term investments or longer-term planning, that 56% of the time it was the women who were thinking more about the long-term financial plan. And I've seen that come through more often, too, when, a lot of people like to just get a financial plan. And I've one of the other considerations we have, and I've seen this a lot actually, is if there's a second marriage. A large percentage of women will outlive their husbands. That often results in and of itself a second marriage. There may be adult children then that are involved, but you need to get everybody talking about that conversation. And when you have a whole lot more adults that might be willing to express an opinion, it can be a little bit more difficult. And then as I said, be an active part of that conversation. When heterosexual couples were asked, 83% of the time the men said they take the lead on the investments for the household. And ladies, I would just say there, it's important that everybody be taking steps to build their own wealth, and you've got to be an active part of the conversation each and every time, not just what you own and where it is, but why do you have it and why is it part of your plan?
So thanks, Susan. So yeah, I've had the chance to speak to a lot of folks over the years about their financial situations, and I think the common theme that comes through is many folks are embarrassed about at least some aspect of how they've handled money and investing over the years. But one conversation really stood out a few years ago, and that's a conversation I had with a fellow called Joe, not his real name, obviously, who was a consulting partner who retired in his mid-50s, and he accumulated $16 million, so obviously a significant amount of money in investable assets. But he began his career with basically with nothing. He had a large student debt and he had very few assets. And as we had a few conversations about how he'd gotten there, and there were seven key steps that really emerged out of the whole thing. And so we're going to dive into each of these in more detail. Spend less than you earn, prepay the expensive debt early, take advantage of all the chances you can to save and invest. Make sure you keep the investments simple and diversified. Use things like dollar cost averaging and rebalancing it, and don't try to time the market. Enjoy yourself so you're actually spending some money but keeping the expenses reasonable. And then finally, teaching the kids financial responsibility. So the first step is by far the most important one. That's spend less than you earn. And if you don't follow this step, then really none of the other things are really become possible. So one of the challenges I think all of us face, and it doesn't really matter what your income is, there's always pressure to spend all of it. And that we really see that with residents, the primary residents, always the pressure to upgrade to a McMansion, adding a luxury second or third home, driving the most expensive car you can afford, going on those multiple luxury vacations. There's really no end to the pressures that we all face to spend money. In some professions in particular face additional pressure, and this actually came up in the Millionaire Next Door. They specifically cited attorneys and physicians as professions where folks face additional pressure because there's an expectation that they're earning good income and therefore have a luxurious lifestyle. So people will say, oh, you're a doctor and therefore you should live in a certain kind of home. And so it does make it harder to save that money as they are starting to earn the higher incomes. And to be able to, one metric to be able to measure whether you're on track or not is the idea of being able to target saving 30% of your target replacement income, and that's basically to have a 90% chance of success. And so why don't we pause here and see if there are any questions before we go further?
Hi. So we do have another question, and so someone is wondering, how do we figure out our target replacement income?
Sure. So target replacement income, so that's really what you'll need to live off of in retirement. What do you think you're going to need to spend? And in the old days, we used to think it was some smaller percentage of what your expenses might be today. I think we as an industry have learned that was probably underestimating how expensive the cost of living would be in retirement. So typically nowadays we encourage people to be thinking about the same level of expenses in retirement as they have today. So if you figure your expenses are, I call it simple, make it simple, $100,000 a year today, then assume it's going to be somewhere in that ballpark in the future. And obviously in today's dollars, it would be a little bit higher in the future with inflation, but that would be somewhere along those lines. Because what often happens in retirement is that people will spend quite a bit up front. You know, in the early years of retirement, when they're healthy, they might be spending even more than they would have, like while they were working, because of all the travel, etc. And then it off over the years. But then you have things like healthcare that kick in. So to keep it simple, just think about spending about the same level that you're spending today.
Thanks. That's all I have for right now, but I will let you know if anything comes in.
Okay, thanks. Well, the second step is prepaying expensive debt early. And as you know, I think everyone realizes, debt, all loans have different types of interest rates that apply to them. You know, a credit card might be 20%, a mortgage might be 4 or 5%. And so the thing that really makes a difference when saving along the way is to prepay the expensive debt early. So prepay those ones that have the highest rates. And a lot of folks still have large student debts, and especially if they've graduated recently, for any professions that require many years of education, the levels of student debt are really, really high. So for attorneys now, back to that example, the average, and it's actually increasing even from these levels we just saw from a year or two ago, the average student loans for attorneys, if they've graduated from a private law school, are $125,000. And it's similar kinds of levels for physicians. And those student loans can be really expensive. The rates will vary depending on a whole bunch of things, but typically what we encourage our clients to do is if the rates are over 5%, then it's worth prepaying them. Because the odds are, if they're a Henry, if they're making a high income, they're not able to deduct the student loans or the interest on the student loans. And so they're paying this after tax. So if they're paying somewhere in the ballpark of 7%, they don't want to continue that. And for many folks now, unfortunately, because we're all aware of how expensive college is and graduate school, so these levels can be really, really large going forward. So let me turn it back over to Susan to talk about potential opportunities to save.
Yeah, thank you. So making sacrifices early, I know that doesn't sound fun, but once you get started on the path to getting college taken care of and saving toward retirement, that can take a lot of angst out of the financial equation. And the rule of thumb here is to start saving, it's $1,000 per child per month for college expenses, and that's as soon as they're born. I think a lot of people are participating in their company offered retirement plans and think if they're saving 10% that that's probably going to be enough. And even with the match, very few offer a dollar for dollar match on your first 10%. So you really need to think about probably increasing what it is you're saving toward retirement from what you may have been thinking in the past. And then be creative about looking for other opportunities to save. We had noted earlier that among those that had more than $25 million in investable assets, that 1 in 5 had started or still owned their own company. When we actually look at just millionaires, those with $1 million in investable assets, actually 2/3 of those people are self-employed, which I find very interesting. And one of the things that you have the opportunity to do when you're self-employed is be a bit more creative. You don't just have to take the retirement plans that are offered to you, but you have the opportunity to consult with somebody and find out, are there more opportunities that would be more lucrative to save taxes and save for retirement. There are also obviously things like non-deductible IRA contributions, and there's a nice little backdoor way to convert that into a Roth IRA. And so you go from tax-deferred savings to tax-free savings in a Roth, always a good thing. A lot of companies are offering HSAs today, so these are health savings accounts. And to the extent that you put money into these accounts and you don't take it all out, when you retire, the money that is still left in that account can be used to pay, can be taken out tax-free, and can be used to pay health care expenses in retirement. So that's another valuable savings vehicle. And then again, if you are employed by somebody else, it may be that they offer something called a non-qualified plan that allows you simply to defer income. Maybe it's been a great year and there's a huge bonus and you had an opportunity to defer having that paid to you till sometime in the future, so that you can maybe smooth out the peaks and valleys of what your taxable income is year to year. The opportunities are going to be different for each person, depending on your particular circumstances, obviously, which is why it's nice to speak with somebody that can, span a range of those topics with you and find the right solution for you. Many of the Henrys, as we said, they're maxing out on their 401k, or they think they are, because they're probably defining that contributing the max, meaning that I'm getting the most match from my employer. But again, just getting the most matching contributions that your employer has to offer may not necessarily mean you're maxing out what you can save and getting to that 20% target. And then key takeaway here being that small opportunities to save, when you aggregate all of these together, start to make a huge difference over time. And that's just the magic of compounding that we can enjoy if we get these things started.
Hi, Susan. Sorry, as we have a couple questions here, just wanted to throw them in there if that's okay. So one question is, should we try to save 100% of our kids' college costs?
Well, I'm going to let Pat take that question since he's in the process of saving for two that are on their way to college.
Yeah, that question does come up quite a bit. And, you know, I think for the folks who are in a position where they are able to save 100% of their kids' college costs, I often encourage them to think through whether they actually want to go that far with the savings. And particularly if you're putting it into a 529. 529s are great because they're a chance for people to save in a tax-deferred way, put money in there that the kids could use when they go to college. One of the challenges is if you oversave and you don't actually need the money, you can use the 529. You can switch beneficiaries. So if you have more than one child, you can actually just switch the amounts to go from the first child to, say, the second, or vice versa. So that can definitely help. But you could be in a situation where you aren't able to use that money. So rather than targeting 100% of the most expensive option, so that's the $1,000 a month, I generally encourage folks to target about 60%. So to actually save in practice, save about $600 a month if they're able to per child in a 529. And then this way, that keeps them on track for the 60% of that expensive option if they get into a four-year private college. And then if they do need additional funding because they need the full amount of this college cost, then they would pull that money from other savings that they might have elsewhere.
Thanks. And then I have another question, and this is for either one of you. What retirement plan options are there outside of a 401k or IRA?
I'll take that one. So, you know, as I referenced a moment ago, the opportunity to be self-employed creates a lot of other options that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the pension plans of yesterday, that you worked someplace for 30 years and you retired and they paid you 60 or 70% of your salary for the rest of your life. And then a lot of those got converted to what were called cash balance plans, where they were frozen, and then those balances just kind of stayed on the shelf and get some nominal interest crediting. But for the most part, people aren't covered by pension plans today. And what people have forgotten is that those plans still exist. And if you think about it in the context of a smaller business, somebody who is self-employed, maybe has a couple of employees, or even just yourself and or a spouse, these pension plans are very cost-effective to set up and provide you as self-employed individuals with opportunities to save far beyond what is allowed through a 401k, sometimes 2-3 times more that you could save. And if you do have employees in that, so if you're self-employed and it's just you, this isn't the case, but if you are also covering employees and that makes it an ERISA-covered plan, then something that I think would be important to a small business owner is all of those assets continue to be protected from creditors, which is a nice bonus as well. So yes, there are other options and you should absolutely explore those.
Okay, thanks. I'll turn that back to you guys.
Okay, thank you. So on the keeping it simple, I know that sounds easy, and people always think if you're going to talk to an advisor that you must be doing something very complicated. But it's not complicated where it comes to investments, because what we really want to focus on here is how do we keep the costs low, and then how do we create an asset allocation, a long-term plan, and adhere to that. So it's really trying to keep it simple and then stay focused. ETFs are exchange-traded funds. They are like mutual funds, which are simply baskets of securities. So you pool the money together and you go out and you invest in multiple stocks, and you do the accounting, and that creates the mutual fund. An ETF is the same thing. It just prices throughout the day like a stock versus mutual funds that are just end of day. that was a whole lot about those, but the fact is that both of these flavors of investments come in an index offering. And what we mean by that is it's not somebody just trying to pick which stocks they think are going to outperform in any given time. Sounds easy, doesn't happen very often, but these just track a stated index. And so most people are familiar with the S&P 500. There are a lot of index mutual funds that simply own all the stocks in the S&P and will mirror the performance of the S&P and then reinvest the dividends. Because they're not trying to pick stocks, you're not paying somebody to do that. The machine is just buying what's in the index. The cost of those mutual funds is very low, very low. So that's a great way to be diversified across a lot of different asset classes and not have to pay a whole lot of money in terms of your investment costs. Now, there may be a couple of areas, and you want to think beyond just some of the basic indexes that we might be more familiar with. So there are opportunities in international markets, in emerging markets. So those are the international non-U.S. that are not developed, so the smaller emerging economies. And then we have real estate investment trusts. And some of these can present opportunities to maybe look for some, we talked about index funds, but maybe to look for some actively managed, because something like emerging markets tends to be what we call a less efficient space. There isn't a lot of research on the companies represented in those countries like there is in the S&P 500. And so there are some really good active managers in some of those opportunities. But the asset allocation itself doesn't need to get really complicated, and it doesn't need to be done through vehicles that are very expensive. And again, the big takeaway here is individuals, it's really not worth the time to try to focus on individual stocks. That's something you have to be looking at on a day-to-day basis. Very few people get that right. Over long periods of time, it continues to be proven that passive index investing outperforms the vast majority of active managers, and these index products do it at a very low cost, which is key. And then if we, one other thing that you want to focus on when you think about your investments is dollar cost averaging, probably, and then rebalancing. We'll talk about that. Most people probably think about dollar cost averaging if you've ever been in a 401k plan. And what that means is that over time, you are going to continue to make purchases of investments. So whether you're getting paid every 2 weeks and you've got a contribution going into your 401k plan, or if it's every month, on some frequency, that money gets deposited and you go out and you buy the basket of securities that you're currently allocated to. And if you're doing that, throughout the year, then what you're doing is you're not trying to figure out what day is the best day to buy or the best day not to buy because the market's way up or it's way down, but instead you're just averaging in. And so you're getting the average of those prices over a period of time. And studies have shown that that typically provides the best pricing overall instead of trying to guess. And then you can be creative. So maybe you don't get paid every 2 weeks, but maybe you have a bonus structure and that's quarterly or annually or something like that. When you get those bigger buckets of money, take advantage of that and just, set it aside, but then make sure that you ratably invest a piece of that in over 6, 12 months, depending on the time frame. You want to keep that asset allocation in line with your goals. So different markets perform differently over time. And so you might have come up with the great asset allocation, but if one aspect of that, say U.S. stocks are outperforming international stocks, then over time you're going to have more allocated to domestic stocks than what your asset allocation would have indicated. So you want to redirect some money into that and keep that just where you want it. And then on avoiding market timing. So it's really hard when the market's down and it's down for several days in a row, and here we are in 2016 having started out with the worst January in the history of the stock market. It's really hard to not think, boy, is this the time to get out? Do I need to just wait on the sidelines until things calm down? But really, trying to time that is a disaster waiting to happen typically. Most people would get it wrong, and even if you go back to the financial crisis, there were a lot of people who panicked and they sold out, and they never got back in, and so they never recovered all of those losses that they incurred because they weren't there when the markets recovered. And then the last thing is because you do have market volatility, again, having some discipline in there to do a quarterly rebalancing and just make sure that you're keeping that asset allocation on track really does pay off over the long run. And Pat, I think with that, turning it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Susan. So with step 6, it's enjoy yourself but keep the expenses reasonable. So this is related to the first step of spending less than you earn. And one of the biggest challenges, as we talked about before, is not letting the expenses grow in line with income. Rethinking the fancy cars, and then dealing with real estate too. So that can be one of the biggest expenses. And one point of distinction here is it may be possible to qualify for high mortgages, especially if you're a Henry. However, the banks aren't concerned with your ability to save for your retirement. They're just concerned with your ability to repay the mortgage. So you may qualify for a mortgage that's probably higher than or more than what you'd want to actually spend or should be spending if you still want to be able to retire or set additional money aside for other goals. Also, thinking about vacation homes, there are ways to reduce the cost for that as opposed to buying a second home that you may not be using very often. So the big takeaway here is really not to let expenses increase as the income increases over the years, but to basically make sure that there is some money that is still budgeted to enjoy yourself, so you are still keeping it sustainable, but not necessarily having a one-to-one increase in expenses with income. And the final step is step 7, teaching the kids financial responsibility. So this is one of the big concerns for many folks as their wealth increases. They really want to make sure that they're teaching the kids the right way to handle money. There can be additional complications if they're adult stepchildren, as you want to make sure that assets are titled correctly, and then ownership goes to the person that you think it's going to go to in the event you or someone else in the family passes on, the person who actually owned the assets before. And so there are also additional things to think about as folks as kids are growing up. So one of the things that Joe did, which other people have done successfully, is for every dollar that their kids earned during high school and college, they actually contributed an equal amount in their children's Roth IRAs. And those are particularly attractive because Roth IRAs accumulate over the lifetime of the children, and they're able to pull them out because they're already after tax. They're able to pull them out essentially tax-free at retirement, which could be in 40 or 50 years. So they've got many, many years to compound and to grow. So Joe had set up a number of rules to really all about setting expectations with his kids, and he was really happy with how that turned out. The first was that he covered the kids' college costs, so that he was obviously in a financial position to be able to do that. But then he was clear to his kids that after college, the kids were going to be on their own, and he communicated this early and often with his kids so that there weren't any shocks with them. They knew that they were going to be fully covered with college, and they were fortunate to be graduating without any student loans. But at the same time, they knew that they would be responsible for their own financial situation after college. So it was helpful to make sure that they were aware of that and could start to plan accordingly. And I think that the takeaway here is that teaching the kids financial responsibility, it's not easy, and there will be times when there are all sorts of other things that kick in, but it really does require discipline and communication.
Hi, Patrick. Katie again.
Yeah.
Interesting question for you. Any other considerations regarding adult stepchildren that someone should consider?
Susan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Actually, I've seen this firsthand a couple of times and very recently. Oftentimes, what can happen is when it's a bunch of adults and everybody gets along at the holidays and everything seems like it's going well, and then suddenly somebody passes on, and then there are these questions that come up about, well, I thought Dad wanted me to have that, and what about this asset, and what is or isn't going to be distributed at one person's death versus continuing to be available to pay for the other person's living expenses. I think those are just really frank conversations you need to have with the kids, and in that way it's not a question of is that what Dad or Mom really intended, but that conversation's been had out in the open with everybody. And if they have questions, then those can be answered, but I think it saves a lot of heartache down the line.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that's all I have for now. All right. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, so once we've gone through the 7 steps, then the question becomes, how do you actually go about implementing them? And I think the key message here is that it does not on the way, it really will not cover 100% there. And then finally, do you have the discipline to keep doing it over the years? So it's one thing to go through the exercise, put the 30+ hours in up front to get it all in place, but then when life gets in the way, are you going to be able to stay on top of it over the years? So if you say yes to all of the 5 DIY criteria above, then it would make sense to hire an advisor. And there are really a few considerations to keep in mind. The one is to make sure that they're legally required to act in your best interest. So are they a fiduciary? And that's come up a little bit in the press. Obama talked about that recently. And it's confusing because there are all different types of financial advisors out there, and they all use the same financial advisor term. One type to keep an eye out for is RIA, or Registered Investment Advisor. Those advisors are fiduciaries, so they are legally required to act in your best interest. Typically, brokers are not, although it would be worth confirming with that advisor to make sure that you understand what their actual legal status is. And then secondly, make sure that they don't have a conflict of interest. So to do that, you would typically want to go only with a fee-only financial advisor, so someone who's not accepting commissions. Again, the terminology can be confusing. You might see fee-based, which means that they not only take a fee, but they also take commission, so they're actually double dipping. But when you see fee-only, that means that they do not accept commissions. In terms of what the fees themselves are, make sure that they're reasonable. So the typical rule of thumb is 1% of assets or less. And then finally, to help protect against fraud, make sure that the assets are held at a reputable custodian, so that the financial advisor themselves wouldn't actually be holding your money. It would be at a big name company like Fidelity or Schwab or TD, and what would happen is the financial advisor would be listed as the discretionary asset manager. So that's again for your own protection in there. So Katie, do we have any other questions?
Well, let me see. And if anyone would like to type in some questions, you can use the chat screen on the bottom of your control panel, or you can also send it through the questions tab, either way. So let me see here. Okay, we have one. Is there anything different you would recommend for women investors, and if so, why?
Well, gosh, I think I'll take that one. So, really, as it relates to women investors, there's a lot of talk about it in the industry. And as I've continued to think about it, I come back to one common theme, and that is, it's not that we need to speak to women any differently than we do anybody else. We just need to speak to them. So if most of these conversations, 83% of the time, are going on with men, then typically anybody providing a service or selling a product tailors their message to their audience. And if 83% of the audience is male instead of female, then that will result in differences over time. And so I think it's not that it would be any different, it's just that being part of the conversation and hearing what some of those are. A couple of things that I have come across more recently that maybe a lot of professional women wouldn't think twice about, but I live in a community where there are a lot of women that are a little older and closer to retirement, and some of them have actually never had a credit card in their own name. Now, they have a credit card and it has their name on it, but it's actually an account that their husband set up and they're an authorized user on that credit card. And that's not the same thing. And then the other thing is having a bank account in your own name. And actually each person should have a bank account in their own name. And then of course you should have a joint account. But you really want to establish some of these things that are in your name only for credit purposes, and so that if something happens to your significant other, a lot of times bank accounts get locked down when they're subject to probate. So you want to always have access to credit and to some liquidity there. So those would be a couple of things. Not that I wouldn't tell every man that too, it's just they've probably already heard it and done it.
Great, thank you. Let's see, can keep the polls open for a couple minutes, but I think that was really fantastic. Thank you both so much. This is really great. As someone who doesn't come from a strong financial background, this is very helpful for me personally, so thank you.
Great, great. Well, thank you.
Let's see.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't see any questions. I was just going to say thank you on behalf of the AMA to you and to all of our attendees for joining us. Patrick or Susan, if you have any closing remarks that you would like to share, I'd welcome you to do so. One final thought is that we've recorded this session, so we'll distribute that to the attendees in addition to, maybe a copy of those slides. So we'll be in touch soon, but thank you very much for everyone for attending. So I'll turn it over to you both.
Great. Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. We were excited to be part of it. There were some great questions there, so thank you for sending them along. Please feel free to contact either one of us. So you can reach me at patrick.cote@assetgrade.com and Susan at susan.powers@assetgrade.com. And feel free to also check out our website at www.assetgrade.com, which has more information about our approach and how we can potentially help you out.
Thank you as well. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.